paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. In my youth, I aspired to be a philosopher. In particular, I wanted to better understand the escalation of evil in the 20th century. I felt that mankind had underwent a metamorphosis after the industrial age, and that the philosophers of old hadn't addressed the underlying psychological mechanisms for this escalation of evil in the 20th century. One day I was at a Unitarian church and it had a lending library. And I saw a book called Escape from Evil. I was intrigued. The book was written by Ernest Becker, someone who I had never heard of before. The second Becker book I read was Denial of Death. After reading Escape from Evil and Denial of Death, I completely relinquished my aspirations to be a philosopher because Ernest Becker said everything I could possibly say, and he said it way better than I could possibly say it. And today, we have someone who has expertise on the thought of Ernest Becker. His name is Sheldon Solomon. He's a psychologist and a professor of psychology at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. How you doing today, Sheldon?
Hello, Nick. Thank you for having me.
So give us a little rundown about yourself and then Ernest Becker.
Sure. Thank you. Pretty much my story is not radically different from what you've mentioned. I graduated from, I finished graduate school with a PhD, and my buddies Tom Pazinski and Jeff Greenberg, also who we went to graduate school together, we all were dissatisfied with the current state of psychological discourse. You say that philosophy was a little deficient. We felt the same way about psychology, that they weren't really able to embrace what we thought was one of the major questions, and that is man's proverbial inhumanity to man. Why is it that even the most benevolent glance at human history is like one ongoing succession of genocidal atrocities juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of in-house inferiors and so on? And so I was in my first week of being a professor at Skidmore College in the library looking for a Freud book. And there were three books on the shelf next to each other: The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil, all by Ernest Becker. And I pick up The Birth and Death of Meaning, and I look at the first paragraph where he says, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I was like, wow, me too. Finally, somebody speaking in plain language, asking bold questions about what makes humans the way that we are. And then I got to The Denial of Death, the first paragraph, where Becker says that it is our uniquely human awareness of death and our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition that underlies a substantial proportion of human activity. And my thought there, Nick, was, wow, that at least sums up my experience. I've been ardently disinclined to die since I was 8 years old, the day my grandmother died, and I realized I would die someday. And then finally, Escape from Evil. I didn't even get to the first paragraph. The book starts with a quote by Thomas Hardy, who says, if a way to the better there be, It comes from taking a close look at the worst. And then Becker goes on to explain how our inability to accept our transience and finitudes as humans is responsible for most of the evil in the world. Becker says, ironically, that most of the evil in the world comes from malignant efforts by people who claim they're trying to rid the world of evil.
With Becker, he was writing in British Columbia.
Yes.
And he was on the outside of the outside. And not very many people knew what he was up to. But then he did get a Pulitzer Prize for denial of death.
Yes.
And then I think he ultimately, was Denial of Death his last book, or was Escape from Evil his last book?
Well, all right, great point, Nick. I will maybe botch some of the details here, but my understanding is that the Denial of Death and Escape from Evil were originally going to be one giant book. And the title of it was kind of arcane, and it had to do with the integration of science and religion. And evidently, the editors at the Free Press insisted that the book be broken up, that it was too large and also maybe too academic-y. So the Denial of Death was not the original title, if I understand it. And so the Denial of Death was published. Becker was terminally ill as he was writing it and only realized it towards the end. He's the only author to ever be awarded a Pulitzer Prize, as I understand it, posthumously. So he never knew that he got it. He died about 6 weeks earlier. Escape from Evil was at the time not completely in order. And my understanding is that Ernest Becker's wife, Marie Becker, who I have had the pleasure of meeting and who's also very able and very familiar with his ideas, that she assisted in getting the final version of Escape from Evil together and published.
With Denial of Death, Becker says that, and as you put it, we do everything we can to distance ourselves from death, to put a buffer between ourselves and death. And that if we're reminded of our deaths, then that will bring out something that's quite venomous in us, or a lot of us. And it's like, it's kind of, one would think that it's an ambiguous concept, that it would be very difficult to prove. But there have been, I think, 177 studies that have proven Becker's thought. The first one was with judges in Tucson, I believe.
Yes, that's right, Nick.
Could you tell us about that?
Yes, certainly. And I appreciate your familiarity with these ideas and also the cogency of your questions, because Becker had these rather stark ideas about human behavior. He's like, look, our awareness of death is unique, and to avoid paralyzing existential terror, we embrace culturally constructed views of reality that help reduce death anxiety by giving us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And whether we're aware of it or not, basically Becker argued that the fundamental human motivation, and mostly we're not aware of this, is maintaining confidence in the veracity of our beliefs, as well as confidence in the sense that we're persons of value. All right, well, this raises the question of, well, how do we know if this is true? Because Becker won a Pulitzer Prize, but he couldn't get a job. Academic psychologists said this is speculative nonsense. It's like poetry. And moreover, they said there's no proof for any of these ideas, and there's no way that you could demonstrate this. And so here's where Jeff and Tom and I come in. We're experimental social psychologists by trade, And when we became familiar with Becker's ideas, we were like, wow, it would be great if we could come up with some way to demonstrate that the ideas have merit from a traditional scientific vantage point. So the first study that we did, as you mentioned, was in Tucson, Arizona, where we were fortunate to get access to a group of about 40 municipal court judges. We randomly divided them into two groups. And in one group, as they filled out a bunch of personality questionnaires, we just asked them two open-ended questions about their own death. Just tell us your thoughts and feelings about your own death and how you might be thinking and feeling as you're actually dying. And then we asked the judges to literally pass judgment on an actual court case. It was an alleged prostitute, and the judges were asked to set bond, which is the amount of money that the accused has to pay to not be jailed until the trial. So anyway, in the control condition, the average bond was about $50, and that was the average bond for that crime at the time. The judges that were reminded of their mortality, the average bond was 9 times higher, $455. And why this is important is that when we talked to the judges afterwards and explained what we were doing, every one of them said, look, there's no way that me writing about my thoughts about death could ever influence my judgment. After all, judges are taught to, rationally and dispassionately administer the law. And then this is not an indictment of the judges, because in fact, that particular phenomenon where people who are reminded of their mortality become more punitive towards moral transgressors, that's been replicated dozens of times. And so that kind of got us going, Nick. And then the next thing that we did was to say, well, okay, you're reminded that you're going to die, and that makes you more punitive. That's interesting, but we thought that for that to be more than interesting, to become important, that we would have to show that when you're reminded of death, you're not only more derogatory towards people who are different or who transgress, but that also increases your affection and support for people who are heroic or similar. So we did another study where we showed that people that were reminded that they were going to die, they were 3 times more generous when they were asked how much they would give as a reward to somebody who thwarted a bank robbery. And as you pointed out, there were several hundred studies that have reproduced these effects. In the last decade or so, there's now several thousand. And we say that not to boast, but to establish the robustness of these effects. They've been replicated in more than 25 countries, in multiple continents, in children as young as 11, and senior citizens in their 80s, showing that this is not a particular cultural or historical affectation as far as we can tell.
So according to Becker, we start distancing ourselves from our death relatively early. And the first buffer is our family, basically.
Absolutely.
And then school.
Yes.
And then we acquire things.
Yes.
And all these mechanisms we use to insulate us from our death.
Absolutely. You said it better than I could. That's quite brilliant, because that's precisely what Becker claims is happening developmentally from a psychodynamic vantage point, that our original psychological security is derived from our attachments to significant others. That would be John Bowlby's attachment theory. As we get older, we become socialized. We become acquainted with the values and practices of our culture and encouraged to behave in accord with them. And then for what Becker says is there comes a moment, it could be as young as 2 for some kids, it could be as old as 8 or 9, where we begin to realize vaguely, not necessarily explicitly, but we begin to realize that we may die someday. We begin to realize that our parents are not the all-encompassing repositories of wisdom, and that they too are mortal and fallible. And it's at that moment that, whether we know it or not, that we begin to cling more fervently to our cultural surroundings and begin to derive a sense of self-worth from what we have and from what we do. And we want our culture to shine its countenance upon us. This is not to say our parents become inconsequential, but the original attachments are expanded symbolically to encompass cultural forms.
And those symbolic selves can be wealth. They can be attaching oneself to a religion, a political party,
sports team.
And what Becker would call that is an immortality project. Something
Absolutely.
that will be around much longer than you. You can attach yourself. Your finite self is frail and it's going to go pretty soon and you're going to be dust. But you can attach yourself to an immortality project that's going to keep going and going and going.
Yes. No, very nicely put. So there's evidently in ancient China, there were sayings that had something to do. Oh, actually, it was Mao Zedong in the last century when he talked about his regime was going to last for 10,000 years. But my understanding is that in Asian culture, 10,000 is a symbol for immortality.
Well, Mao certainly knew a lot about death.
Yes, that's well put.
So we've got these immortality projects, and one of the real problems in society is when immortality projects clash with immortality projects. Now we're coming up on an election where we've got the Republicans thinking that the Democrats have lost their mind. We've got the Democrats thinking the Republicans have lost their mind. These are two immortality projects that are butting heads. And you guys pulled off a study that I'd like you to explain to my audience, the hot sauce study, that epitomizes two immortality projects that are completely incompatible.